Welcome back to the Azure Education Governance Series. This is video number 5, focusing on Azure subscriptions and related best practices. My name is Eric DeBoard. I'm an Azure TSP at Microsoft, joined by Amy Manley and David Uoa, also Azure TSPs at Microsoft, and we focus on education. So let's go ahead and get started here. Just a quick review, where is Contoso? Contoso Education, they had just defined their enrollment hierarchy in our last video, video number 4, and they're ready to move forward and define their subscriptions. So I guess the first thing is, what is a subscription? And basically a subscription is where you actually deploy resources. So of all the things that we've done so far in this video series around governance and the enrollment hierarchy, we haven't deployed anything that costs money. Subscriptions are where you actually deploy things like virtual machines, storage accounts, networks, those sorts of things. Subscriptions can be considered a billing container. You can have many subscriptions, unlimited number of subscriptions. You could create multiple subscriptions for a number of reasons. They could be considered a billing container, a security container, a way to separate production from development, from any number of things. You can create them. Subscriptions have scale limits. The scale limits are very high, but there are scale limits. So for example, any particular subscription can have up to 10,000 cores. I'm referring to them as VMs here, but that's per region. And as you probably know, Azure has a lot of regions. We have over 50 at this time. So any subscription could have up to 10,000 cores in a region, per region. You can have 200 storage accounts by default per region. You can increase those limits though by making a request. Something to point out here really quick, there's a nice URL that you can go to learn about these limits I'm talking about, aka.ms/edu/limits. Let's take a look at that really quick. I have that opened up. This is the link, and so I just want to quickly point out how this works. If I scroll down here, I can see service-specific limits. So for example, if I go down and I select virtual machines, let's click on that. Here you can see that it's telling me about some limits related to virtual machines. If I go back where I was and I go to something like storage accounts, for example, you can see that there's a default limit of 200 storage accounts per subscription. So the things you're going to see on this web page are specific around limits. Often you'll see it listed as default and maximum. This means that the default limit in this case is 20 CPUs for VMs per subscription per region. The maximum can be up to 10,000 like we just mentioned. So just know this page is here. It's a very good resource to go to.
Hey Eric, one of the, again, in talking to customers, kind of like the first limits that customers would typically run into would be the CPUs per subscription.
Yes.
And just to keep in mind, we'll show you in the portal how you can request to increase those limits. But as customers deploy subscriptions, that's one that you want to just keep an eye out.
Okay, so let's talk about some best practices related to subscriptions, because everyone out there wants to know, when do I create subscriptions? What is the best way to go about this? The first important point to make here is that typically the fewer subscriptions the better. It's also always good to have a dev test subscription separate from your production subscriptions, and it may also make sense to have a training subscription, especially for new users that are just kind of getting used to the portal itself. And obviously it's important to consider dedicating subscriptions for production workloads. This takes out the ambiguity. If you're in a subscription, it's very clear that it's production or dev and test, and so that can help you with your overall governance. Let's talk about some important decisions around making subscriptions and what Contoso needs to consider. They're going to need to consider who are going to be subscription owners. So who is going to have access to a subscription so that they can deploy anything and manage role-based access controls, all those sorts of things in their subscriptions. Do they want to have other access models such as read-only users? Maybe you have people who are going to be monitoring the infrastructure and they need read-only access. Important to note here, we're going to talk about role-based access controls and options, and we're also going to talk about Azure AD and resource groups in later videos where we'll get really more granular about access controls into subscriptions. Another important point, it's not important, you don't have to figure everything out at once, just get started. Super important concept there. So let's do just a quick demo here of what subscription management looks like in the management portal. So I basically am back to my management portal here that I showed in a previous video. And I'm just going to go straight down to my shortcut here for subscriptions. Now, if you didn't have this shortcut there, you can always click on all services and find subscriptions in the entire list. If I click on subscriptions here, I filtered this down just to show one subscription. I can change those filters if I want, but I've got this subscription called Eric Workshops. Let's take a look at the subscription. If I click on it, this is where I can access the properties and better understand what this subscription is all about. One of the most important things is access control. Again, we'll get into more detail around this later, but this is where I define who has access to this subscription. Okay, and you can see that I've defined for my particular subscription a lot of different access models. So David here on the phone is an owner of the subscription. I've also got other people in here that I've played around with. So that's an important panel. Another one to point out here is this usage and quotas. David just mentioned about requesting additional cores or whatever it might be. This is where you can do that. You can click on the request increase and define what it is that you want to increase.
Hey Eric, if you click on request increase, a couple of things to keep in mind. Again, especially if you have a project deadline and you're approaching those limits, always recommend that you keep tabs on those limits, and if you're running against a particular project, just be aware that sometimes requesting this increase of resources limits may take a couple of hours.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, so you maybe want to plan in advance, but you can see here that you can make a request and select what you're trying to request and go through the process. We didn't point this out earlier, but this is very similar to how you get help and support with this link here. The only difference is it will ask you a different, which category to choose. We're basically focusing in on the service and subscription limits category or issue type. Okay, so there's a lot of ways and a lot of tools here for configuring your subscription. We'll get into more of these later on in other videos, but just wanted to point out how this works. The other thing I want to point out really quickly is how would I create another subscription? I am an account owner at Microsoft, and so if I click on this add button at the top, we alluded to this a little bit in a previous video, but if I click on the add subscription, I can go through the process of creating another subscription. Now my offer is going to be different than what you see for yourself because I'm an internal Microsoft employee and we have some different options here. But if I click on this subscription for internal consumption, it's going to take me to an area where I can basically create the subscription. Okay, I'm not going to go through the process. This also looks different than what you'll see, but that's how you do it. Now, one other important thing about subscriptions, super important, they're going to be called something by default, Microsoft Enterprise Subscription. One of the very first things you're going to want to do with these subscriptions is click on this rename button and name it something that is meaningful to you. So production or training or dev test. So make sure that's one of the very first things you do. Name those. Otherwise, they're all going to show up as a Microsoft Enterprise subscription, and you're not going to know the difference between them by quickly looking at them. Takes away another level of ambiguity there.
Eric, another point to call out right there within the overview of the subscription, you'll see the associated directory. For us, it happens to say Microsoft on Microsoft.com, but for education customers, that should be your Azure Active Directory.
And that's a good point too, David, because this by default, this directory you're going to see here is going to be based on who the account owner is. I'm the account owner. I have an account in Microsoft on Microsoft.com. This subscription is therefore going to be governed by that Azure Active Directory. Now that can be changed. It is possible to change that, but that will be the default directory. Now, another important point is that any one subscription can only be governed by one Azure Active Directory. So just an important note there. Glad you brought that up, David. Okay, so let's talk about what Contoso has decided to do based on what they've learned about subscription management and best practices. If you remember, we have Brian, who is an account owner for the medical research department, and Monica, who is an account owner for Central IT. So Brian has decided that he's going to create a production subscription and a training subscription. He's not interested in dev test just because of the nature of the research workloads. Just really not interested in it. However, Monica, if you remember, she's over Central IT and a large group of technical teams. She has decided to create a production subscription, a dev, QA, and test subscription, and then a training subscription. And so, again, as an organization, you might not have a model that looks anything like this. You might go straight away and have no departments at all. You might have a single account owner, and you may have just a couple of subscriptions. So it's up to you, but we're trying to help you understand why these decisions were made. So let's review our overall enrollment hierarchy again with the knowledge of our decisions we've just made. We can see here again that we've got David and Amy as enterprise admins, Eric and Brian as department admins. Brian is also an account admin, and Monica is an account admin, or an account owner, I should say. And here is the subscriptions they created based on what we just talked about. Okay, now each of these are entirely separate entities that can be fully isolated if you'd like. Okay, and just to wrap up this video, Contoso has a lot more decisions to make, a lot more things to consider. However, they're feeling good about getting this far along. They have a subscription model identified and they're ready to move forward. At this point, they're very interested in understanding cost management, pricing, and things like our hybrid use benefits and VM reservations. So in the next video, David is going to lead a discussion around these topics. So again, we're glad you joined us and look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.